Now, there has been much controversy in Sri Lanka with regard to the role played by the United States government. To talk all this and more, we have with us the U.S. Ambassador of Sri Lanka and Maldives, Ms. Patricia Buchanan. So, very good evening and welcome to our special discussion here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, ma'am, in 2020, I interviewed you and you told me, just before the presidential elections, that when I asked you a question with regard to reconciliation and accountability, you told me that the Sri Lankan government has to do more, and that you are looking forward to work with the government that will be appointed subsequent to the 2020 presidential elections. 2.5 years on, where do you see the government right now?
Well, I think you put your finger on a key point of our engagement here, which is to promote reconciliation. And I remember the interview. And I think there's been a lot of progress since that time in certain areas. And I think sometimes the government doesn't get enough credit from us for that. For instance, the IDPs have largely been resettled. The ex-combatants have gone through a very good rehabilitation program, even though there was skepticism about their legal status. And I have to say that the economic infrastructure that's being developed in the North really does contribute. So in those areas, I think there has been progress, and we've helped support some of that. But I think in other areas, the government still can do more, and I think Secretary Clinton made this point when she received Minister Pierce in Washington a few weeks ago. And by that I mean addressing more psychological, social needs, and of course the way to do that, in our view, is through the recommendations of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. I think the government has an excellent roadmap in its own commission.
As you said, ma'am, the government has an excellent roadmap. I still recollect the manner in which Professor G.L. Pierce, addressing Parliament following the tabling of the LLRC recommendation, said that the international community has to give the government time and space to implement the recommendations. However, 3 months on, the U.S.-backed resolution comes into play in Geneva. Can results be achieved promptly, ma'am?
Well, not promptly, but the clock didn't start ticking when the LLRC report was tabled. It actually started when the war ended. So
but do you agree that reconciliation is a long and tough process?
Sure it is. Sure it is. Of course it is. And that's why we have focused so much of our energy and attention and offered support on it. But I think that the government sometimes has shifted its resources and attention to other areas like economic development, which, as I said, are important, but that doesn't get to the heart of reconciliation. And so I think that it's only fair to also acknowledge, as Minister Pierce has, that Secretary Clinton publicly said, give the LLRC time to do its work through its hearings, come up with its recommendations. So 2 years after that fact, when they started, that's what we're looking at, and that's where we appreciate what's been done, but we see how much more needs to be done.
The government really looks at this resolution as a Western conspiracy to topple the existing government, a regime change. Is it so?
No, of course not. And I've heard this accusation repeatedly since I've been here, and I just think it has absolutely no basis. Whoever is in power is the decision to be made by the Sri Lankan voters. We have absolutely nothing to do with that. In fact, I've said it personally, and others have said it publicly, that we think President Rajapaksa remains very popular with the majority community, and he has the standing to actually implement additional measures toward reconciliation. What we'd like to see is this government, any government in Sri Lanka, sticking to a path that leads to increased freedom for the media, more reconciliation, reinforcement of rule of law. That's where our interest is. It's not at all in who is governing.
We'll take a look at the protests that were launched against the U.S.-backed resolution. You saw a man in which a lot of people were arriving in Colombo and protesting against this resolution in question. What is the message that is being echoed through such protests against the U.S. government itself?
Well, first of all, we support the right for peaceful protest, and I'm happy to see people are able to get on the street and express their views. I know some of the demonstrations had some official support and organization. Nonetheless, we accepted the petitions and we read them. And the arguments in them were very familiar to us. But let me also say that there are a lot of other people in Sri Lanka who agree with the recommendations, who agree with the recommendations of the LRC report, which is what our resolution was about.
Do you mean to say, Ambassador, that the host government mobilized people against a rightful diplomatic mission?
I think they encourage people to express their views in that way. And the demonstrations that came to the embassy, at least the ones that when I was there, were quite peaceful and orderly, and we were happy to receive them.
Let's say the Sri Lankan government does not stick to this time frame. In November, the Universal Periodic Review is going to be taken up. And where do you see Sri Lanka at that point of time?
That's up to Sri Lanka. That's up to the government.
Let's say the government does
Let
not
me
stick.
finish. Let me just say that the governor of Sri Lanka actually pointed to the Universal Periodic Review that's coming up at the Human Rights Council in Geneva as their chosen moment to showcase or brief people on what they'd accomplished. So I'm hoping that they will actually have a very strong track record to present.
Speaking in Geneva, Minister Mahinda Samar Singh, who was representing the Sri Lankan government as the Minister of Human Rights, said that those inside glass houses should be watchful when throwing stones. Was this directed at the U.S. government?
You'll have to ask the minister.
Taking a look at the past track record of the United States government itself, there has been different yardsticks. It seems that there has been different yardsticks for developing countries and the country, the United States government itself. Has that been the case?
No, I don't think so. I think we adhere to general overall principles of human rights. That's not to say that our own record isn't subject to criticism or questioning, and when that happens, we agree that people have a right to examine our own actions. I don't see that there is a double standard, and I think that there was pretty widespread support for the resolution in Geneva that I think reinforces what I've said. But again, let me just. I think the focus should be on what the government of Sri Lanka will do, because I think we have been very clear in our expectations of what we'd like to see the government continue to work on and initiate in areas where it's not perhaps addressing yet. And I think other members of the international community also feel that way. So the focus will be on what the government of Sri Lanka will be able to talk about.
Ambassador, when you look at events, how it has unfolded in Sri Lanka following the end of the conflict, events that have unfolded in Iraq, events that have unfolded in Afghanistan, events that have unfolded in Lebanon as well, I want to know, how are things unfolding and why is Sri Lanka in the spotlight at this particular moment in the eyes of the United States government? I
wouldn't say Sri Lanka is in the spotlight. I know it looks like that from here perhaps, but we pay attention to events in Sri Lanka because Sri Lanka is a democracy. Sri Lanka fought a terribly violent war. The government, the army, defeated the terrorists. We consider the LTTE a terrorist organization. It remains banned as an organization in the United States. So we provided support to a certain extent while that war was being fought. So of course we have a vested interest. But I would like to point out that Sri Lanka also has international obligations. It signed various treaties, upheld certain principles, and so that's really the context. It's not at all, I would say, a unilateral focus on Sri Lanka.
Let's drag the attention completely to a different dimension now. Professor Peiris met with the U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in Washington, D.C. I want to know what was the outcome of this particular meeting in question.
I can't talk about diplomatic conversations, but the Secretary before the meeting talked to the press and talked about her focus on the LRC recommendations and looking forward to hearing about what the government had in mind to implement them. She mentioned some other issues that she wanted to talk about, among them accountability for alleged human rights violations. I think the point here, though, is that this was meant to be a very positive meeting. The Secretary invited Minister Peiris and asked him to come and brief her and other members of her staff on what the government's vision was and what its intent was and what its progress was. So I think we were very happy with the meeting. That's not to say, though, that all the expectations were met. Our focus and our concerns remain very much on the implementation of the LLRC report recommendations, which is the government's own commission. These are recommendations that the citizens of Sri Lanka told the government's commission mattered to them.
Ambassador, you said expectations were not met. What do you mean by that?
Well, the Secretary was briefed on the government's way forward to get to an action plan. Okay, that the minister and his colleagues briefed about the steps the government was taking to produce an action plan to implement the LLRC, and that was a very thorough briefing. But the action plan itself remains to be produced, and that's something we would look forward to seeing. The other element of this is the issue of accountability, which has remained a concern. And the LLRC report, as we've said before, in our view, doesn't adequately address the whole range of concerns. And we look to the government, as we have in the past, to develop a mechanism that would address those accusations.
You said that an action plan was discussed. Does that mean that an action plan was submitted by Professor G.L. Pires to the U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton?
There was no secret plan. I think that there is this misconception in the press and among society at large that there was some sort of secret action plan, and there was none. What the minister briefed on was what the government is doing, soliciting input from various members of the ruling coalition about which recommendations should be implemented or not. Then they're going to organize. They're going to analyze the submissions, and then the president, I assume, in consultation, will decide which recommendations will be accepted, which ones be implemented first, and then come out with which government body will be responsible. And I understand the presidential secretary, Lalitha Wiratunga, has been appointed to oversee the actual implementation. So that was the briefing.
So there was no document as suggested by opposition quarters that was...
I don't know what the opposition has said. All I'm saying is that they discussed in detail the government's way forward.
MP Anukumar Dissanayake, speaking in Parliament, said that the government has submitted an action plan to the U.S. Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, secretively. That is the document that I'm talking about.
Well, I'm telling you, I'm unaware of any document, and I don't know what the opposition is referring to. I think part of the issue may be something that the secretary talked about during her meeting with the minister, that it would be in everybody's interest if the government could communicate more with the citizens of Sri Lanka about its intent, about the steps it's taking. That we benefited from a very good briefing, and the secretary encouraged the minister and the government to share that kind of information on a routine basis with the people of Sri Lanka.
What is the way forward for Sri Lanka? All this and more after this short commercial break. Stay connected, stay with News First.